Thanks. This is the session on sports, economics, and finance. I think that's what it's called. I'm Toby Moskowitz. My role here is to introduce our guest speakers. Thank them for coming, taking time out of their busy schedules. Let me just give a brief introduction of each of them, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to each one of them to talk for a little bit about a topic that they've worked on or that they're interested in, and then we'll kind of open it up to some questions I have and maybe some questions from the audience about sports analytics and applying economics to sports. So let me start with Brian Burke. He's the founder of the website Advanced NFL Analytics, which was founded in 2007. If you've ever seen the fourth down calculator or the win probability models that are all over the TV and the media and the internet these days, he calculates those things. He's a leading voice and contributor to football analytics. Currently is a senior analytics specialist at ESPN in the Stats and Information Group. He's contributed to the New York Times, Washington Post, Slate, and consulted for multiple NFL teams as well. Just a little bit of background on Brian too. Prior to getting involved in football analytics, he was had a distinguished career as a naval officer, an aviator, flying with a FA-18?
18 Hornets.
For about 15 years. Numerous commendations for his service as well. And in fact, he took the training he had at the Naval Academy and later a master's degree in operations research and now applies it full time to the field of sports analytics. A lot of football, but also other sports as well. To his right is Dean Oliver, one of the pioneers in sports analytics. He literally wrote the book on basketball analytics in 2002 called Basketball on Paper. He was one of the first analytic consultants in the NBA and has worked for several NBA organizations. Dean also worked at ESPN and still works indirectly with ESPN in the field of sports analytics. He's currently the vice president of data science for TruMedia Networks, which provides analytics to teams and digital media and broadcast media, which is now permeating some of the sports that we watch. And then finally, to my right is Jeff Ma. Jeff is a member of the infamous MIT, everyone has to mention this, don't they, Jeff, whenever they introduce you? Yeah, the infamous blackjack team at MIT, the basis for the main character in Bringing Down the House and the film 21, and changed his name twice, I think, in those two media. He has founded or co-founded 4 successful companies that use a variety of different data analytics tools. The most recent one acquired by Twitter, which he's currently CEO of TenXer, acquired by Twitter last spring. And done a variety of sports-related themes. There was ProTrade, which was a sports stock market website, Citizen Sports, a sports information website and app, and these companies have been acquired by not just Twitter, but Yahoo and Virgin as well. TenXer deals with developing talent and looking at, in particular, at software engineering and how to make that process better and identify how to allocate resources better. He's also the author of the book, The House Advantage, Playing the Odds to Win Big in Business in 2010. And also, in addition to his role at TenXer, once a week or more perhaps is on SportsCenter talking about predictive analytics. He's the predictive analytics expert at ESPN, often talking about the spread on today's NFL games. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the work he's been doing.
Thanks, Toby. Appreciate it. Let's see. Let me fire up there we go. So Toby asked me to talk about something novel and interesting, and I think everybody's pretty sick of the fourth down thing. We've got our own Twitter bot now, and everybody's familiar with the fact that draft picks are, the discount rate on draft picks is in the 1,000% range. So let's do something new and interesting, talk a little bit about the NFL draft, little novel application, some simple stuff, some fun stuff, and you'll be seeing more of this on ESPN draft coverage later this year. But first, let's start off with the obligatory, what is sports analytics? This is how I think of it. There's 3 kind of main things about sports analytics. There's things that fans really want to know about. That's, who's the best team? Is my quarterback better than your quarterback? The things that fill up the comments section. at the bottom of the internet articles, those sorts of things. Fans really, is my team going to make the playoffs, and so on. Things I'm really interested in, I think probably most of us who talked about this, are things that are interesting to teams. So what makes teams win, what makes teams better, which players should we select, and that's what I'll talk about is player selection and how to help teams do a better job of that. Then there's things that maybe you folks might be more interested in terms of this human laboratory that sports offers for research. And so behavioral economics, of course, is one great application. So I don't think anywhere else in the world you can have a confined, controlled, repeated experiment with the same rules with human beings in the petri dish over and over and over and over again like you can with sports. So those are the three main things. So what I'll talk about today, though, is really kind of at that intersection, in that overlap of what's interesting to teams and what's interesting to fans. So football analytics is really, really hard. There's 22 players on the field simultaneously. It's chaos by design. It's pretty difficult. So in comparison, especially when we compare to other sports, no offense to Dean, but there's football is very, very hard. There's billions of permutations of game states, where in baseball you can have, I think, 26 different base out states. It's very discrete. Football is a very continuous thing. In baseball, you have these sequential series of matchups between pitcher and batter, and there's 162 games. There's just almost nearly infinite sample sizes to do analysis. Basketball, there's 48 minutes. There's only 5 players on a team. There's frequent rotation. There's lots of great things that offers a lot of great hooks to do some very solid analysis that football lacks. Football is just small sample chaos. So one approach I thought might make a lot of sense is to do this hybrid approach. A lot of sports analytics, especially the fans, the niche fans of sports analytics, are kind of fundamentalists in terms of this needs to be purely quantitative. We can't let any sort of qualitative judgment enter the picture at all and pollute our results, because objectivity is kind of the prime directive of sports analysis, and there's such hogwash, and the mainstream analysis for sports is such hogwash that we want to get as far away from that as possible. But I think there's room, and even in football, I think there's necessity for a convergence between a kind of a qualitative approach and a quantitative approach. And I'll explain what I mean and give you an example. So we start with analysis, qualitative analysis by experts, and then we put that into some sort of quantitative model. And then that model produces insight that we can use to gain an advantage on our opponents or learn something about the sport. And then they can also go back and educate the experts themselves and help linearize their estimates, improve their estimates. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so the NFL draft is critical. So player selection is the NFL draft is the primary means of selecting players for teams. There's free agents, obviously, but this is where you get your career players, your franchise players, and it's essential. Success in the draft is essential to success as a franchise. So the problem statement here is that teams, rationally or irrationally, and probably more irrationally, but they have their reasons, they target certain players. They believe that certain players, much more than others, fit a certain scheme or fit a certain profile, and they get attached to these players, and they desperately want to make sure that player is still available for them when it's their turn to pick in the draft. But they don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty around all these things. There's trades, there's all kinds of different variables. And so what I wanted to do is create a model that helped teams can relieve a lot of that uncertainty and then help them make better decisions, because trading draft picks is the main currency of player selection in the NFL. So teams will trade up, trade down, and as I discussed before, there's a huge discount rate. So if you can be one of the smart teams that can trade down, you can multiply your selections, and that greatly improves your chances of success. So analytically speaking, we want to know what's the probability that player I is still available at selection number J, and that's a simple question we want to know. So what we're going to do is use a little bit of math to help quantify that. We've got, I work at ESPN now, so my two favorite draft analysts are on the screen right now. And then my third favorite is Reverend Bayes. So we'll use Bayes' rule to, he didn't know he was a draft analyst back then, but he is. So then we're going to use that to help us figure that out. Just try to get our arms around the problem and just come up with a realistic estimate. So the Bayesian approach allows us to do a few things. Allows us to incorporate that expert opinion, the qualitative information, and we can weight that in proportion to how accurate those experts have been in the past. So the strength of the update in the Bayesian process can be, is only as strong as how accurate those guys have been. We can also add more information iteratively. So each expert, we can add expert after expert after expert and continue to refine and gain confidence in those estimates. And then lastly, we've got a kind of very elegant mathematical property of probability where everything's got to add up to 1, so it makes the Bayesian math pretty easy. So just in case you want the nuts and bolts of how this works, we'll call A the event that player I is selected. That's selection number J. So some certain players picked 5th. That's going to be our A. Event B is the event that player I is projected by an expert to be selected at selection number K. So Mel Kiper says, oh, this player is going to be selected 10th. So we can start out with any kind of prior. We can start with a uniform, it's probably safest, or we can have an informed prior, which I prefer. I'll go over that in a second when we look at the example. And we can look at the likelihoods from recent history. So we're going to know how accurate those experts have been. So when Mel Kiper says a player is selected 10th, how far off is he? Is he off by 2, by 1, by -2, by -5, and so on? So what's the distributions look like there of those experts' accuracy? And then we know that across the board, the sum of all those probabilities that the player is going to be selected at a certain pick is going to add up to 1, especially at least for the players we care most about. They're going to be selected at some point in the draft, so all those probabilities are going to add up to 1. Okay, so here's an example. Pardon. If you're a Key and Peele fan, you'll recognize Osmotaz Buckshank. I think he's from Stanford, actually. He's a local running back. And so I'm going to start with an informed prior. I'm going to say that we're not going to worry about projections as far as when and which team he's going to go to. Just in terms of straight number 1 to number 500 ranking, who's the best player coming into the draft this year. And so let's just say he was ranked 10th overall. And these are big board. It could be a consensus of big board, quote unquote, big board rankings by certain services that do this sort of thing. And I'm just making up numbers here for simple math. Let's just say that guys who are projected to be 10th or ranked 10th get picked 9th 20% of the time, 10th 40% of the time, and so on. And so that's going to start out as a prior. Then we've got our first expert comes along and says, no, I think Buckshank's going to go 11th to the Falcons. They need a running back, and so on and so on. So we take that information, and we know the prior. We say, well, okay, what's the probability that a player projected to be 10th by an expert is actually taken 9th, 10th, 11th, and so on. And then we can do our Bayesian arithmetic. We come up with a probability distribution that he's going to still be available at or rather be selected at each pick number. So that's what it looks like graphically, and you just continue, you can iterate that kind of math, and you get, you combine that information into a resulting distribution. Now we've got a second expert. He says, I think he's going to be taken 9th. And now we can add that information, repeat the process. And here's a real example of what it looks like once you add expert after expert. The if they agree, you're going to get a tall, narrow probability distribution, which is high confidence, which makes sense. So if they all agree, we can all be confident. We can't be perfectly confident, but that's the distribution. Notice how wide it really is, too. This is a very, very dangerous game, predicting when players will be drafted. So we start off with the fainter lines are kind of the early iterations, and then the darker lines are the later iterations. And then in teams, from a team perspective, they don't really care that a player was selected exactly 8th or 7th or 5th. If a team is selecting 10th and they want that player, they just want to know whether he's still available at 10th or not. So a survival analysis is very helpful. So I can tell a team that this particular player, the colorfully named Ha Clinton Dix, I think, who was drafted by the Packers, is a cornerback. I could say that there's a 10% chance that he'll still be available at the number 20 pick, which I think he was taken at the 21st pick. So he's not the best example, but that's how it works. Then we can throw in some more information. So we don't have to stop with the expert predictions. We know that teams have certain needs, certain holes at positions, either because players are retiring or performance, injuries. We know that teams need a running back, teams need a linebacker, teams need a pass rusher, and so on. So these are generally agreed upon. I mean, we can debate and argue, and there's some gray area definitely in terms of what a team's needs really are. But there's general consensus. So I took the top 3 just for my toy model that I made. Took the top 3 needs based on the different experts I looked at, and looked at how often teams actually select players from that position. And then if a player does fit that need, so a team, let's say, is drafting 10th, and they need a running back, I can increase the probability that running back will be taken at pick number 10, and decrease the probability that non-positions of need would be taken. So we throw in another adjustment, use the same process, and then we get a kind of an ugly kind of, I don't know, some kind of mountain from, Lord of the Rings or something. Over there on the right is the result. So it's very discontinuous and jagged result because teams have different needs. And we can put that back into the survival analysis. Oh my gosh, my phone, sorry. Anyway, so let's take it a step further. This is interesting. We've done the research. We can do it for a year or two. We can apply it and get some answers, but how do we really make this useful to a team? And that's to create some kind of tool. And so that's what I did. And it can update live as the draft goes on and add new information as players come off the board, and you redo the model. So that's the Bayesian draft model.
Thanks. Before we move on to the next speaker, I don't know if there's any questions from the panel for what Brian just presented. I'll start off with one, which is just in terms of weighting the prior or thinking about forming that prior. Can you also use over time the precision and the error rates of each individual expert as well as the cross-sectional variation, right? There's a difference. If everybody agrees this guy's going number 10, that's probably more informative than if there's a ton of heterogeneity around that. Yeah. Or if it seems like you're already taking into account the fact that maybe Mel Kiper's is wrong, how good he is.
I set out to do that. That was my intention when I started doing this, but unfortunately there isn't a sample size that goes back far enough in time. At least I didn't. Before I started working at ESPN, now I do. So and since Mel works for us, maybe I can go back and get his, I really researched, I had like archives of his old, newsletters and things that he put out, and that was really hard to find, but very helpful. He's the lone exception because he's been going back, he's been doing this since like 1979, since he was a kid. And but some of the other places, some of the other sources haven't existed for very long. So I have a one homogeneous expert and one distribution. What I do vary it for, so across the expert dimension, it's uniform, but across the where in the round, what round are we in dimension, it changes. So experts are much more accurate in the early rounds and far less accurate in the late rounds, just because there's a lot more information, a lot more attention on those early rounds. So in order to do both those dimensions, the sample sizes were just too tiny.
And so having worked in some draft rooms on the NBA side, it's interesting trying to predict where people go. I've been in draft rooms where they predicted in the NBA draft, the first 12 guys, exactly spot on. And it does start falling apart after that point. But one of the ways they get the information, and they're doing it right up to the draft, is they're calling around. You call around to the teams, and it's like, oh yeah, we decided, or they decided, and all this. And Joe Lunardi does the same thing when he's trying to say who's going to the NCAA tournament bracket. It's not just a probabilistic thing. So when you're trying to build a model for who's going to get selected, whether it's for the tournament or in the draft, it's not going to be as good as those guys who are sitting around a table just calling the other teams and getting that information.
Yeah, so there's a couple teams that use this. A few teams use it, a couple use it religiously, and the problem is there's this one-way check valve of information. That information is so valuable, and it is top secret, and they do not want, so I'm an independent consultant for them, and I help multiple teams, so they can't afford the chance that they would get fired. Anybody who released that kind of information in my direction would get fired on the spot. So what I do is I just built a tool where they could populate, an Excel spreadsheet with their own estimates. If they know for certain, they can type in a 1 in that cell, and everything else turns to 0. But I don't get to see that stuff.
I would imagine not.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Any questions from the audience about Brent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My second follow-on to that is, have you actually tested your model against the experts to show that actually your model performs, let's say, ex ante better than all the experts?
Yeah, there's so many different ways to kind of judge accuracy or success in something like this. And I only have 2 years of out of sample. So the data is kind of precious, so I've started this 2 years ago. So I've got, so to answer your second question first, yeah, it simply by the nature of the fact that it's kind of a wisdom of crowds, kind of an average of everybody else's, just to put it very roughly, of predictions, it's going to be probably better over the long run. So within, I think, when I graded it out after last year, at least through the first round, there was, I think, 85% probability of plus or minus 3 picks. So a span of seven selection picks. And to answer your first question, so mock drafts, so that's what they call them, mock drafts. So these experts, and there's a lot of them, and you have to pick good ones, reputable ones. They put out mock drafts, and they update them continuously, and they call around as well. They try to get as much inside information as they can, and they put, based on player talent and team needs and rumors that they hear and other factors, they make a long list from, depending on the expert, maybe 2 rounds or 3 rounds worth of predictions.
Another question?
Yeah.
So looking at that to figure out where the players actually take when you kind of predict which trades are going to happen.
Yes. Excellent point. And I left some stuff out just for time. not because I don't trust you guys, but yeah, so there's a team need, but I left quarterbacks out. There's a special set at QB variable that I throw in there where I can pretty much rule out that the Packers aren't going to take a first-round quarterback, or Tom Brady. If you're set at, you have a Hall of Fame quarterback in his prime, you're not going to trade up into the first round to take a quarterback. So there's an adjustment there. I set aside quarterbacks from the rest of the positions as their own. They are solely important. And also I detune, I mitigate the effect of the position and quarterback effects in the model based on the probability that that pick is going to get traded away. And then I don't know, I'm agnostic at that point to where it's going to go, what team's going to need, what position is going to be needed at that pick at that time.
Your prior is a pre-informed prior, so it's a big board, an aggregation of everybody. So
Yeah.
don't you think like using Bayesian analysis to update when you're saying hyper is probably better than a diffuse prior or a layperson prior? But I mean, how confident are you, besides the fact that you work with ESPN, that this kind of updating is actually going to be valuable?
Well, there is, based on the fact that generally, so I guess the best way to answer it is, it may not be an informed prior. I mean, everything really starts with a uniform prior. And whether I call that first kind of iteration of information a prior or the first or the first posterior, to me is kind of semantic.
The aggregated, you input the aggregated big board views, that's actually, you're calling that.
Yeah, so there's, the experts only go down to the top 3 rounds of the draft. So the first, 96 picks. So past that, all you really have are those kind of best to last rankings. So that kind of serves the purpose of estimating probabilities for those players that don't get, and then some players are included on an expert's mock draft. So it might be in the first couple rounds. Some are left out completely. So I can't have it 0. I don't want to have a 0 in there for that player as well. So it serves that purpose. So there is a kind of a independent problem of independence at that point, where it's not strictly independent. As long as it's conditionally independent, then we're safe. But yeah, I think that's something I know is something I have to keep an eye on.
I think we need to move on to the next speaker, but we'll have time for more Q&A at the end as well. Let me turn it over to Dean Oliver. Thanks, Brian.
We have my presentation somewhere.
Yeah,
is there?
I think it's,
Yeah, I didn't look at.
should be right behind this.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it'll look up.
Oh. That worked. Well, okay, we're not even getting to that. It's funny, so when I went to graduate school, through graduate school and first probably 7 years or so after graduate school, I basically insisted on having an equal sign and or a Greek symbol in the presentation. Since I got into sports, I don't. But Brian had one, so thank you. It kind of reminds me of those days where I had to do that on a regular basis just to feel like I could still do science. But actually, sports is a lot more math and a lot more science than I really did when I was doing consulting. I was an environmental engineer. I did a lot there. I did write programs and all this sort of stuff. But sports has some great math associated with it. I'll promote it for some of the most challenging stuff that I do. And I do some work on football still. And the trigonometry and stuff that you could do with that data is interesting. My name is known much more for basketball. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where we're going now, which is the revolution of the moving dots, as it's been called by some people. We have data for every player and the ball and the referees, but they don't like to let you know about that, where they are at every second, actually 1/25th of a second in a basketball game. And this is a huge data set, of course. I've been told it doesn't qualify as big data. It qualifies as medium data, which I didn't know we actually had. So how to use that in making decisions when you're a team is something I'll get to. But in order to get there, I've got to give you a little bit of Basketball Analytics 101, and we'll try to get to the graduate level by the time I'm done in 10 minutes or less. So Basketball Analytics 101 it starts with the team level. What does a team do to win? Well, that's a very basic question. You outscore the other guys. You won the game. It's simple. You score more points. It's a metric of quantity. Well, a lot of things that we like to do in basketball is turn things that are just quantities into a measure of quality. Because what we have also is we have a pace. Each game is played at I won't say a constant pace, but each team has equal opportunities to score. If you score a jump shot, the other team gets the ball and they get their opportunity. If you turn the ball over, well, you just had your turn, they get theirs. If you miss a shot, they get a rebound. In a game, each team has the same number of possessions. But, of course, there are some teams that play at a faster pace. The Golden State Warriors, the local team, they are the best team in the NBA. They play at the fastest pace. They score a lot of points, and they also allow a lot of points. People look at the number of points per game that they allow, and you want to say they're average or below average because they allow a lot of points, but they play at a very fast pace. In fact, if you normalize the points they allow by how many possessions they have in a game, they're the second best team in the NBA on defense. They get all sorts of notoriety for how good they are offensively, and they are the best. They're incredible offensively. Steph Curry, if you don't know about him, I'll talk about him a little bit more, but everybody knows about Steph Curry. Their defense is completely underrated, and they play very small. It was talked about in the finals last year. Their biggest guy typically was 6'8" out there on the court, and they are dominant when they play small. It's very unusual, but it's important to know, as a result of normalizing by possessions, that they are that good defensively. People get it. The numbers saw it probably a little bit faster than kind of the general historical eyes did. So what you're seeing up here is pretty well understood and pretty well accepted, that's how you rank offenses and defenses. Points per 100 possessions. That's what you're seeing here, points per 100 possessions. So Golden State, 114 points per 100 possessions. Philadelphia is down at the bottom, considered almost a minor league team or a college team at this point. That's a whole other story. That's 23 points or so difference between the best and the worst. It's a huge difference, much more than typical seasons. On the defensive side, you see a variation of about 18 or so between the best and the worst. This is accepted. Now, what makes an offense or a defensive efficient? What are the things that you can do? Well, we actually understand this to some degree. There's this thing called the 4 factors, and it did fly in there. I never know if these are going to work. These are the 4 things. If you can do these things well on offense and on defense, you will be good. And they are ranked in order. So this can come from regression analysis. There's a number of different ways you can actually get at this, but it's kind of a mechanistic thing. If you shoot well, that's pretty important. In most leagues across the world, shooting is very important, is the most important. On a scale from 0 to 10, it's about a 10. Turnovers, second most important. That becomes more important, approaches the importance of shooting when you go down to lower levels. So some of the lower levels where they don't handle the ball very well, where you're allowed to press, turnovers can actually be much more important. And then rebounding and free throws. Those 4 things, you measure those 4 things, that tells you how to get to what you see in these tables. It's an understanding of really how the game goes from a kind of a team basis. Basketball Analytics 102, though, and then talks about the players. What do the players do to contribute to those 4 factors? I can tell you one of the most common things that I see when I talk to people who want to get into basketball analytics, they want to build a better player rating. There are a lot of player ratings out there. There are some that are pretty good, and there are a lot that are not very good. I'm going to talk about a couple here that get at a little bit of the quandary and some of the things that are relevant for evaluating players. Because frankly, that's where we start getting back to what I started with, the player tracking data. But for now, what we're looking at here is a ranking of players by two different systems. One is labeled PXP and one's is labeled RPM. RPM is ESPN's real plus minus. PXP is a very different flavor of things. It comes from things that are in my book. The difference between these in many ways is, so RPM is a regression-based technique. It just looks, mostly just looks at how well the team does when you're in the game. You score 40 points in 30 possessions when this guy's in the game, and you allow 20 in 30 possessions. And it looks at, we have enough different sequences where guys go in and out of the game to look at this and assign a value to a player. It incorporates implicitly everything that happens, things that are not measured, things like spacing, or whether your defender is sticking so close to you because you're Steph Curry and you can shoot from 40 feet away. It incorporates that. That's not measured in play-by-play or box score metrics. It's the measured stuff in this PXP thing that we are accounting for what's measured, and we're not doing as good a job with the things that aren't measured. They do tend to overlap a lot. I can tell you that this is ranked by PXP, and there's 30 players there, and 23 of those players are in the top 40 in the RPM. So there is definitely a correlation, but they're not the same. And frankly, understanding some of the differences for why one has Enes Kanter at 23rd, I believe it is, and the other one has him 153, can be difficult to figure out. And I can tell you another reason it's difficult to figure out is because the PXP method right now is just accounting for what they've done this year. The danger with some metrics, and I can tell you RPM has a little bit of this, is that it's not just what they've done this year, it's actually trying to be predictive at the same time. Not just descriptive. We know there's descriptive, predictive, and then there's prescriptive. And understanding those differences, they all have value, is useful. I believe the Enes Kanter rating for RPM is so low because he was terrible last year. He was really bad, and he was bad for previous years before that. But I don't know, because I don't know all the intricacies of what is an RPM. So being able to figure these things out, figure out the differences between these player ratings, what really goes into that team, which we do kind of understand, is challenging. Plus, these represent who a player is, their skills, but also how they get used. So Steph Curry is up at the top. He commits a lot of turnovers. But clearly that's not hurting him in a lot of these ratings. But what if you put him in a situation, what if you used him a little bit differently so that he's not committing as many turnovers? Right now, the second metric up there, RPM, has no ability to handle that question. It has no ability at this point to incorporate this player tracking data. Will there become a way? Maybe. These are some of the things we're talking about. The first method, the PXP, there is a way. There's a potential way to incorporate these things in. So let me show you a little bit of the player tracking data. Right now, the player tracking data is a lot of X, Y, and T data. It just shows you where they are, at what time, and for the most part, it's getting used for simple data. And I think actually you said it on your webpage for scorecasting. Data is great, but that's not the model. It's not. You said it much better than I did. But this is just, in my mind, just data. The bottom one, the Kevin Durant, is just showing where he had his first touch on a possession. This doesn't. Stan Van Gundy said at one of the Salon conferences a couple of years. Stan Van Gundy's a head coach. He's a head coach in Detroit, and he said someone told him from this data that Paul George ran 200 miles last year, and he said, I have no idea what to do with that. And from a coach's perspective, you look at that, I don't know what to do with that. And frankly, some of this stuff, at least this upper one, it says the defender is 7.1 feet away from player number 2.
That tells you something, but I wouldn't know what to do with that either. That's the question that we're now trying to answer with this data. Can we build it into the player value metric? Can we now tell you that Steph Curry is this valuable because even when he doesn't have the ball, his guy defending him is 3 feet away all the time. And that basically makes it a 4-on-4 game for the rest of his teammates. So how much credit should we give him for that? A lot of my job is deciding how to divide credit with data like this or other data for how much those guys deserve, what goes into the team. And then there's a lot of stuff that has been done on that. Ben Alamar, who works at ESPN with Brian, he's done some work on dividing credit. I've done a lot. It's in football metrics, the QBR metric that is used there, how you divide credit among the teammates so that it adds up to the team, so that you're rewarding people correctly for what they're doing is a lot of what we want to do. And I know a lot of labor economists as well, and some of what they have to do is along this line too. How do you evaluate a worker's productivity? It comes down to dividing the credit for some of the things that aren't necessarily measured as well as they are in sports. Fortunately, in sports, we do have a lot of good measurements. You're never going to get this kind of measurement for people who work. I don't think we're going to get this kind of measurement for people who work in an office. It is the benefit of working in sports is you have incredible data to work with. But then you have to use the theory to really get at the stuff that's useful for making decisions about trading for guys and whether they're undervalued because of how they're used or maybe they're accurately valued because their skills aren't that good. And that's what we'll do with this data. So, okay, we'll stop there.
All right, so I'll start with a question I had. I thought you made a really interesting point, actually, about model failures. It's one of the things in finance we think about a lot, right? Which is our asset pricing, for instance. Our asset pricing models are mostly interesting in the ways they fail, not so much the ways they succeed, because that identifies interesting places where you want to look and understand why is this model not picking this up. So I thought you made a really interesting point that model failures are certainly differences across different models. Actually identify some of the most interesting material. And I just want to ask, just to what extent are teams looking at that? Or do you think, is it that teams, my sense is they adopt their favorite model and they sort of run with that. Are the better teams looking at lots of different models and actually looking at the differences and the failures rather than, I mean, you need both, but, so I'm just curious as to.
The process within teams is variable, highly variable, of course. But yes, the teams that have the smarter analysts and the teams that are open and understand that there is variability in not only models, but opinions, and respect the fact that there are differences in opinions, usually can say that, oh yes, there are different, you can say, there are all these models and we can look across them. And it's not just a matter of averaging them. It is understanding which ones have done better in certain situations with certain types of players. And I have done that extensively myself, and sometimes you rework a model. I have definitely reworked certain models because I knew of the weaknesses that I figured out I could improve those weaknesses without losing the strengths. But a lot of times that's hard to do, and there are these different classes of models. And in some situations, that's why I keep the different classes of models separate. And I know the strengths and weaknesses of each of them, and I consider them in making decisions and talking to a GM and talking to the scouts very carefully about that.
Other questions? Right here, quick.
Do you use models to determine what players work best together, how to build a team? And do you build models to design what offenses and defenses operate best with a certain group of players?
Those are some of the models that are going to be coming about with some of this new data, because this kind of data didn't really exist much before. What had been done before was simple data for, oh, we've got these 5 guys on the court and they performed at this level. This other 5 guys is down here. It was no model, it was just data. Now that we have the data for how to use these guys, this can be done. So what's been happening at this point is they've used this kind of data to classify, to put it kind of in basketball language. We can take this data and recognize with machine learning, this is pick and roll, this is a post-up, this is an isolation play. And as you teach the machines to recognize more and more, then you get it to the language of a coach, and then you can ask it these questions for, okay, we've got Kyrie Irving back, and we've got LeBron. Both of them kind of play the point, so how should we best use them when they're on the court together? Should we have them on the court together? Those models are primitive at this stage. Yes, it's a combination. I would say right now it's mostly data, and frankly, a lot of the people who would know how to put those kind of models together, when you start working in sports, you don't get paid a lot. So a lot of those guys, and we were talking about this, they're going to go work for the LSVs of the world. So, yeah.
Is there a question over there? Back there. Well, I'll get you. You already got one, right? Yeah, please.
So there are teams that employ models and analysts, but that some players don't. Like Kevin Durant famously has his own personal data analyst who has a model. I'm curious if you could take us through the way of what sort of conflict there might be or agreement between players, teams, other groups in basketball as far as
That conflict is nothing compared to the conflict that you implicitly have with a team. Everybody wants to win, but everybody wants to be the hero. So it's that balance that you have, that a coach and a GM and everybody around is trying to strike so that players feel like they are very valuable in winning. There are players who will value getting their 20 points and 20 assists over winning. That is more the struggle. I personally have not run into a situation where there are players who have metrics and they're fighting back on what the coaching staff or anybody is saying at this point. And my understanding, I know a lot of people in the OKC organization, they've not had any problems with Kevin Durant having other data. Steph Curry is another one. He has some of his own data coming from Vantage Sports. They collect independent data, and you look at some of that. I think you still try to distill it into a solution to a problem. And as long as you're getting there, you're not going to have too many disputes about that. And I have not heard of any disputes at this point.
Right.
To use another comparison to finance, problems that we face in finance, the problem of things getting arced away or the crowded trade, so like people undervaluing corner threes, and now everybody knows about it. There's a backlash. Right? You're working with teams. You guys monitor the ebbs and flows of the value of these things over time.
Yeah, you definitely monitor it. You see if those advantages go away. San Antonio has been really good at this. Certainly, so what you're talking about, though, are a lot of rules of thumb. Like the corner three, layups and threes are your most valuable thing. And that's a rule of thumb. And my thing with rule of thumb is, they call them a rule of thumb because it's useful. Because thumbs are what humans have, bears don't have. You can have a bear box because bears can't get in, they don't have a thumb. But if you use them too much and you're all thumbs, you're clumsy. And that's my point with teams. The smarter teams, they will recognize that the most important rule of thumb is customize what you do to the talent that you have. Because if you don't, you're going to get beat. Your talent isn't as good as at employing those rules of thumb, then other teams are going to be able to take it away from you more easily. So we definitely monitor it, but more importantly, you try to monitor, do we have the right guys to employ the best strategies?
Well, to that point, I think it's sort of an interesting thing that I think that is sort of not recognized when people sort of oversimplify sports analytics, is how there is these inefficiencies that have developed over time that are disappearing very much now because more and more teams are employing the data is being made more readily available, and the ability to get advantage now, especially in something like, one of the things that's interesting is Daryl Morey, who was supposed to be on this panel, when he started working with the Rockets, when he started working with the Rockets, I said to him, Daryl, basketball is so challenging. And he said, well, that's why I want to do it, because if I can do something well there, I can gain an advantage. When he looked at what people were doing in baseball with these sort of discrete events, and it's simple. It's because the problem space is much more simple. It's harder to gain an advantage long term. So when you think about some of these, as we're saying, rules of thumbs, they're very simple. You know, San Antonio was certainly the first team, I think, that recognized the value of the corner three, and they were, you know, but quickly that became something that could be quantified analytically and everyone could see it. And so that's not an inefficiency really anymore, although you can tell the teams that are more analytically inclined, not so much just because they take a lot of corner threes, because they understand how to defend the corner three also. So I guess when you think about sports analytics, especially going forward, the fascinating thing is going to be, where do teams gain advantage going forward? And it's not going to be stuff that people in this room know, right? The good teams are going to know it, and they're not going to put it out in the public domain, and they're just going to know it.
So, you know, one of the San Antonio, right there, San Antonio is the best defensive team. That number is far better than they've really ever posted. And so they probably have figured out another inefficiency to be able to be that good defensively, and especially as their best defensive player, one of the best defensive players in the history of basketball, is aging, and they're having the best defensive year. And so monitoring it, I haven't had the time yet to figure out exactly what they're doing. And right now, the traditional way to do it would be to watch tape. But with this all the moving dots, now we have the ability to potentially analyze it from that perspective as well.
Well, they're a perfect example, right? Because if you look in the popular, and this is the same as finance, right? If you're reading about something, some theory, it's probably too late, right? It's to employ it to make money. When you think about like everything that's being written right now about basketball, and it's all about pace and space and efficiency and things like that, and small ball, and everyone wants to be the Warriors and whatnot. The Spurs went the exact opposite. They have the biggest team that they've had in a long time, and they're playing slower than they ever played. And like we said, they're doing something defensively that no one's figured out yet.
So Portland, LaMarcus Aldridge, who's with San Antonio right now, he was in Portland last year, and they were a team that played two 6'11" guys. I can't remember if it was 6'11" or 7-footers on a regular basis last year, and their defense was dominant. Their defense was excellent. I studied the system that they used last year, which I thought was actually very, very good. This year, they have the same coach, understanding the same system, but they don't have all those big guys to use as much. And so there's a talent and there's a system. And as I say, fitting them together is very important.
The one thing I would add to that, Ray, which you know as well as anybody in this room, is obviously in financial markets, it's harder to know if something stopped working, right? Because the signal to noise is so low. At least in sports, there are definitive outcomes where you have a hope of figuring out has that, you know, for lack of a better word, arbitrage opportunity gone away. But that's what makes it really difficult.
The other thing we have both in finance and sports has is the backlash against those who utilize these techniques, whether due to randomness or being popular or whatever, they stop working, right? So you might see it now with whether it's the Dallas team or the Sixers, if there's an analytics team that either just poor talent or bad luck or whatever doesn't work, and there'll be a backlash and then I think you see that from finance with a lot of the things we do too.
Yeah, you have to have long term.
Popularity and this phenomenon will then contribute to things. So that's why I think there's great analogies between where sports analytics is now and where finance is.
All right.
Move on to Kevin.
Let's move on to Jeff. So Jeff Ma is next, and I'm
What do you want to do this? Do you want to stand up there?
whatever's comfortable for you. You want to sit down?
I'll
Yeah,
sit,
you can
yeah.
sit. So I'm gonna ask Jeff a bunch of questions about some of the stuff he's been doing lately with TenXer and stuff he's been done in the past too. But let me start off with, Dean mentioned a little bit about modeling human performance in the basketball context. You've done a ton of work on this. So
Yeah.
let's
Well,
start
I kind of
with that.
laughed. I kind of laughed when Dean said, like, we will never have this type of stuff for workers, because that's like exactly what my company that I sold to Twitter was trying to do, right? What we were trying to do was, and it's not the same, right? And I always would say to people, we're at the stage of sports where people weren't collecting data yet. They were, we're trying to get people to mark down hits and walks and runs and track that. I think the fascinating thing is that everything we do these days, we produce a digital footprint, and that digital footprint every day means something. Does it always mean the same thing? Does it mean the same thing for the same people? No. But if you go from sending, say, 45 emails a day to all of a sudden sending, 2 emails a day, it might mean something. It might mean you're on vacation. It might mean you're sick. It might mean you're tired of your job. It might mean you're job hunting. But it means something. So the goal of my last company, TenXer, was to try to find ways. And what we really wanted to do was we want to try to take this data and empower it to make people better at their jobs, not necessarily to create a management tool that would be a very top-down look at what people are doing. We wanted to actually create a way for people to be motivated by understanding their own statistics and their analytics. And the story I always tell is like the Barry Bonds story, right? Barry Bonds was a good baseball player, probably a great baseball player, but became one of, if not the best ever, by being motivated by a number, right? He watched Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire chase a home run title and get all this adulation, and he looked at that and said, now I need to get that adulation. I need to chase a number. He changed his workout regimen a little bit, maybe improved it a little bit, and he became one of the best ever. But a lot of that was being motivated by a statistic. The problem with work is that we don't have a lot of statistics to chase to understand our own performance. And so with the digital footprint that we produce, and it's interesting because so many things that you think about in your job, whether it's calendar invites or emails, or if you're a programmer, if you use something like GitHub or source control or any of that kind of stuff, Dropbox, those things, they all represent work that you're doing and activity that you're doing. So how do we take that and make that interesting, consumable, and useful is really the challenge. And so that's what we were trying to bite off at my last company.
So in relation to that, I mean, one of the things that, whether we're talking about sports or, investment firms or anything really, is identifying top talent and nurturing that top talent. That's where the value is. We certainly know that's true in sports. What kinds of things have you, I mean, to me, that seems like one of the primary goals when you're developing talent. So what are some of the things that you guys have done, either in the sports realm or
so in the sports realm, we did some work a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, with Ben Alomar at the time when he was working with us at ProTrade, trying to identify the right players to draft in the NBA draft. And we actually used some of Dean's stuff, and we basically created a data set with the top, with all the players that have been drafted in the last 20 years, and we took all their sort of college statistics and threw them in a bucket, grouped them by position, and we used O rating and D rating as being top 10 in that at your position by your third year as the definition of success. So now that's one of the things that becomes really hard when you build something like this, is defining what success is. So we did that. We basically just did a big regression equation, found a bunch of variables that were correlated with success, and created some equations for different positions, and created a way to predict success for NBA players based on college statistics. Now this is incredibly challenging for a few reasons. One, the NBA draft happens once. Teams get to draft maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 players. So the sample size to use a tool like this is so small that it's marginally useful, right? It's one other input in addition to what a scout says or whatnot. It's challenging. When I went to my last company, I wanted to do something similar for developers because we had developed all these sort of similar type metrics for developers. So we were actually in the process of working with large companies and having them identify their top 5 to 10 people, or their bottom 5 to 10 people, because everyone kind of knows who their top guys are, and a lot of people know who their bottom guys are. It's the middle people that they don't know. And so we were in the process of basically doing this and trying to replicate sort of the work that we had done in the NBA for developers when we sold the company Twitter. So we never finished that work, but that work I think would have been pretty interesting if we had gotten around to seeing whether it could be useful or not.
Well, and in particular, I think one of the things that I know, at least one of the organizations that I work with struggles with, is how to identify people that are maybe in that middle group, but potentially could be in the top group, right? And how do you
Yeah.
identify them early enough to not only retain them, but to get them there faster, right? And this gets into another topic I wanted to ask you, but which is, you're looking for causation when you do that,
Right.
right? You're looking.
Well, so that's we had this conversation, but that's a perfect point of the model that we built for, like I'm not an economist, right? I'm not classically trained. I've never taken a single class in economics. So like I know stuff just from like working in this area and talking to people and reading and things like that. So when we built this first model, we were looking at it and I understood like the limitations of it and whatnot. But now that I think back on it, I'm like, holy crap, this is just a bunch of correlated stuff that isn't necessarily causal at all, right? And one of the things that when we were first looking at this model, the first pass at it, it had like a negative coefficient for height. And I was saying, so this person is too tall, that's why they're not going to be successful in the MBA. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. We got to go back and relook at this. But what it was saying essentially was that people probably, this is what I think it was saying, was that oftentimes due to height, people get drafted higher than they should. And those people end up tending to be busts because they're overlooking things that really matter to go after something like height, right? But of course, this model, when it's looking for correlates, is going to point out something like that, but it's not saying that you shouldn't draft this guy because he's too tall. So I've now, as I've become, one of the things I love about sports analytics is in learning and getting more. I run a group now at Twitter, which is sort of the central analytics group at Twitter. The work that we do there is so similar to the work that we're doing in sports, where we're working with people around the company that are sort of these somewhat non-believers, believers, whatever, and we're trying to take what's in their heads and create analytical frameworks to help make better data-driven decision-making. And one of the problems with Twitter is that we have so much data, like I think a terabyte a day or something like that is what we produce. And when we look at a lot of this stuff, of course you're going to find tons of correlates for any question you're asking. But how do you actually understand like whether these things are causal or not? And we've done like, some crazy stuff, but in some respects the only way to do it for sure is via experimentation. But then you have challenges around experimentation because do you want to give people, your users, what you think is fundamentally a worse experience because you're testing something? And when do you do that? Do you do that? How long do you do that for before you just say, okay, this is fine, let's move forward? I don't know if that was.
Yeah,
along the
no.
lines
I
of
mean, I
what you're-
think, look, in economics, right, we struggle with this a lot, right? There's always the trade-off between narrowing the set of variation to a very limited range where you can identify precisely what's causing what,
Right.
but then does that matter you lose the sort of magnitude of how much it matters, right? And that's one of the other challenges with experimentation. In your world, I think it's even harder because, like you said, there's these other consequences, right? Which is you're making an experience, let's say, for the employees more negative. In
And one of the
short run
things
than
when we
cost.
do experimentation, it's hard because we're eliminating network effects that might happen when we release the thing to our population, and if we're doing experimentation on a variety of different features, you're going to see network effects when it goes out into the real world that you didn't anticipate. So.
And in the sports world, going back to your experience there, I mean, my guess is they're even more reluctant to run experiments, right? It's
I don't even
right?
think that there was like, at least, I don't know. The problem with experimentation, and the problem with the analytics in general, right, is for it to work, you need people to be patient, right? You need people to actually commit to it. You need people to be okay with it not working all the time, right? If you say this is going to improve us 51%, that there's still not going to be perfect. So I think experimentation is one of the things also that takes a lot of patience, and people don't necessarily have that patience. Like Bill Belichick, the reason he's like pissed off about Chip Kelly getting fired by the Eagles, he's like, what, do coaches only have like a 1 or 2 year window? That's why coaches and managers and GMs are often making terrible decisions, because they're not making decisions based on winning or losing. They're making them based on keeping their job, or they're making them based on too short a time window to make the decisions, for these decisions to actually mean something or matter.
Well, this is a common problem not just in sports, but in finance too. I mean, Ray alluded to it earlier, but I'll make this more general to the panel just because that's a question I was going to ask later. But how do you overcome that? I mean, Jeff, I'll start with you, but how do you overcome that, or try to mitigate it?
I mean, I think you have to. Well, so you alluded to it, and I'd be curious to hear what you guys all think about it. But the 76ers situation is fascinating, right? We all of us know Sam Hinkie really well. I mean, I have tremendous respect for him. Like, I would, I look at what he's doing, I understand it, because I think that if you think about the difference between sports and finance, is in finance you might just be trying to beat the S&P, but in sports you're trying to be 1 out of 30 teams that wins a championship. So having some level of variance and understanding that you could be 30th a couple times to be first once is okay. And if you look at like what Billy does with the A's, and I think to some degree what Sam's doing with the Sixers, and what Darryl does with the Rockets, you're going for these players or these situations that give you high variance. And when that variance is on the low end, you're going to be terrible. But when that variance, when they all hit, you're going to get some situations that the A's have gotten, where they've gotten guys that were never that good, have career years for them. And so I think you asked me, how do you deal with this? How do you convince people? I sat across the table from Jerry West when he was at Memphis, and I had just started a company in sports. We had Billy Bean and Bill Walsh on our advisor board, and we needed a voice a face for basketball. So I went down to Memphis, sat across from Jerry West, and Jerry West, the first things he said to me was, "Boy, I got to tell you one thing. I hate statistics." I said, all right, this is going to be a really fun couple hours in Memphis. It's like August and 95% humidity. And I spent the next 2 hours with him. And he didn't hate statistics. He hated, in his words, that people thought Allen Iverson was a good basketball player, even though he needed 30 shots to score 30 points. And that, at the core, is what analytics is all about. It's understanding efficiency. It's understanding those things. And, Jerry West did not hate statistics. He hated the way that people were using statistics in sports. I think one of the most important things when you try to convince people of this stuff is you need to be as approachable as possible. I think for a long time, people in our area in analytics have tried to be smart, right, first, because it's their badge of honor. They want things that they do to seem hard because that's their value. But you don't. You want the things that you do to seem easy on the exterior. You want to be very approachable. You want to understand that there's time and place for stuff. I was talking to this guy, Dave Finocchio. He's the guy that started a website called Bleacher Report. And we were talking about the content business, and we were talking about the challenges that Twitter faces in the content business. And we have gnarly ML guys and data science guys. I mean, we have some amazing, amazing people there. And he said to me, he goes, everyone in Silicon Valley optimizes for this idea of technology and scalability, when the reality is, if I were running Twitter, I would just hire 500 editors to curate the data. Because there are still things that humans can do better than machines, right? And admitting that and understanding that is an important part to sort of the process of getting things accepted. Now, could you end up improving the algorithm based on these 500 people, or could you use machine learning to give these people tools to make it easier for them to curate? Yes. But should you rely completely on ML to deliver this? No, probably not.
So with regard to your question, I think that Jeff hinted at it a little bit. What I say when you're talking to Jerry West or when you're talking to the scouts that were portrayed in Moneyball as old school, is you are there to speak that sport. You need, in my world, I speak basketball to them. And if you can speak basketball, you're just introducing the concepts of the analytics by speaking basketball. And you have to know everything in the playbook, and you got to curse sometimes because that's what they do all the time. So you speak their language, they get comfortable with you, and you can introduce those concepts. And like Jerry West said, he understood that Allen Iverson wasn't as great as, well, the other factor that matters, which is a lot of times the media historically, and particularly before ESPN really had an analytics group, there was a lot of portrayal of players as better than they are or worse than they are. And a lot of times the media serves as an exaggerator. So in the case of of what's going on in Philadelphia or a lot of places, the best and the worst get exaggerated a lot. And that adds to the pressure on owners. The owners in Philadelphia, they're pretty calm. I don't think of them as rushing to a lot of decisions. But if the media pressure is there on a regular basis, and they go to parties and they go to business meetings, and people are constantly asking you about this, you just hear it, and it affects the way you think on a regular basis. So certainly that applies for the people in the front office as well. But the owners, they can accelerate that process because of it's their baby.
Well, I mean, to along the same theme, I mean, the fact that all three of you work directly or indirectly with ESPN is testament to the fact that people are trying to break down these
Yes.
barriers, right? I mean, the communication, I think Jeff had said this first, which is being able to communicate this, right? It's not about stats versus not stats, but about, making better decisions and using every tool available to you. That's starting to happen, right? I mean, otherwise, the 10 years ago, there wouldn't have been the three of you at ESPN, right? I mean,
And there's a challenge that I know ESPN is running into, and we will run into as an analytical culture, which is you develop something that's good, but then you want to improve it, and you improve it, and okay, for someone like a media property, historically they've relied on facts. Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points, Kobe scored 80, whatever it was. Now if you're setting a record with an analytical metric, that metric can change because we improve the process, and that is definitely one of the challenges that for us as an analytical group of thinkers.
So one last question for Jeff from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Jeff, you've also done some work on, I know you read a lot about cognitive biases, and obviously that's a big part of some of the stuff that you try to do when you're evaluating talent. Do you think, what's your opinion in terms of the analytics, not just helping explain how to make better decisions, but how do you help it overcome some of these biases, whether it's, biases such as overconfidence or omission bias or other things that you sort of see in this business? I mean, that's a big part of it as well, right?
Yeah, so I go on, my title at ESPN is Predictive Analytics Expert, and it's just a fancy way of saying the gambling guy, because that's what I normally talk about. But one of the things that I, like this morning, 5:45 and 7:45 a.m. when I'm on, I mentioned recency bias, right? And because in gambling markets, people are impacted a lot by what they saw recently. So the Seattle-Arizona game that's happening right now, Arizona opened a 4.5-point favorite and was bet up almost immediately to 7. They were a 7-point favorite, right? That was based almost all on an overreaction, I believe, to what people saw that week, which was Arizona demolishing Green Bay and Seattle losing to St. Louis. If that game had happened the week prior, the line probably would have been 3.5, 4. Now, one sample set, Seattle's demolishing Arizona today. But that idea of recency bias, and I think like cognitive biases for me, like the Wikipedia page that lists all the cognitive biases page is like the most interesting page, right? Because it's just this cool list of like all these biases that we have that it's interesting to understand why we have them or what they are, and you see it in like gambling, you see it all the time. In sports and gambling, you see it all the time. You see things like loss aversion, where people make mistakes based on being afraid to lose. Like coaches do it all the time. You see a lot of confirmation bias, where people will look back and say, "Oh yeah, this is thing." You'll see a lot of like results-based analysis that is not good. Like the fourth down thing. As much as everyone in this room maybe knows it, Brian, when you're talking about it, people still don't understand it. And if it doesn't work, they still will say it was the wrong decision. And if it does work, they still will say it was the right decision. So I think just being aware of cognitive biases and understanding how the only way to really overcome cognitive biases is to become data-driven. Because no matter how aware you are of cognitive biases, they're in us. We'll still make them.
Yeah,
I see myself making them all the time.
I'd say process-driven rather than data-driven necessarily.
Sure, sure. That's fair. But I think part and parcel to that in this day and age, it's being data-driven.
Because it depends on, so whether it's a sports model or economics model, a model, when you boil it down, is really nothing more than a collection of assumptions about how the world works. It's really all it is. I mean, it could be fancy equations or Bayes' rule or whatever, but it's some sort of assumption about causality and about how the world works, whether it's a sporting event or an economic outcome, financial outcome. And so one of the greatest services I think we provide is the simplest, and that's pointing out these fallacies and using, and that helps improve people's models, not necessarily analytic quantitative models, but just the way the world works. So in football, we have this classic fallacy, causation fallacy, where running leads to winning. And you wouldn't believe that there are still professional coaches coaching right now on the sidelines as I speak who subscribe to this fallacy, and that's that the more we run, the more likely we're going to win. And that's great because teams that are already ahead by 20 points just run the ball because they don't want turnovers and it makes the clock expire. And so if you can just teach a team or a decision maker refine their model, you don't really need, he's got data, he's using data, data's on his side if he believes that. The challenge is really changing the mental model behind how he applies that data. So if you can say, well, hey, kneel downs correlate even better than running, so let's just start kneeling the ball down in the first quarter and you can fire me and you don't need me anymore.
Was that what Kirk Cousins was thinking?
Yeah, exactly. I tweeted that, by the way. So I think it's one of the greatest services. We're just kind of a voice in the room of kind of intellectual modesty, maybe, or or sophistication, I guess, in some ways as well, where you don't need kind of very complex models, but you just need just a kind of fundamental understanding of kind of how the world works. And yeah, I think that's one of the best services we can provide, and it has nothing to do, or very little to do, with advanced statistics.
So let me open it up to some questions from the audience. Yes.
We can't have a panel like this without bringing up fantasy.
I was planning on it, but I'm glad. Go. Yes.
We all know about the efficiency in point spreads, and we hear that people making money in fantasy are sophisticated algorithms. I mean, how efficient is that marketplace as far as prices and things like that? And how quickly does that change? Any opinions on that?
I think it depends on what sport you're talking about. Like in the NFL, NFL is incredibly efficient. I mean, it's incredibly efficient, and the challenge, and it's efficient in a way that I think that you wouldn't necessarily think about, which is that basically you have, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, because it's become a very interesting question around a group of people that I know that try to make their money off betting on sports. And the question is basically where the only way to really bet on sports and win is if it's an inefficient market, right? It's not, you can't make money unless there's inefficiencies. So where do the inefficiencies come from? And where can you gain an advantage? The information asymmetry, not really there anymore. I mean, once news gets out, it becomes pretty public pretty quickly. So, back in the day, there were times where people were like, oh, I just ran into a bunch of the Trailblazers. They stopped in Vegas last night on their way to play LA. We should all bet against them. There really was that kind of stuff back then. That's not there anymore. So like the inefficiencies, I think one of the inefficiencies I think has to do with strength of competition, which I think is one of the hardest things for a lot of analytical systems, and these guys may disagree with me, but a lot of analytical systems, like in college football, you can kind of see a lot of inefficiencies that come around strength of schedule because of the different conferences that people play in and the limited sample set. That's probably the other thing is limited sample size. So inefficiencies probably come about when people interpret limited sample size in different ways. Like an NFL season in itself is a limited sample size. You know, at the end of the season, do you even know how good any of these teams are? They've played 16 games. Would you make judgments based on 16 games, based on 16 trials? So I would say that's where they would come from, but generally it's a very efficient market.
It seems very random to me. Like, you've got, I don't know, it depends on what kind of fantasy you're playing, but you've got, if you play season-long fantasy, right, the traditional fantasy, you've got injuries, which are, despite what people claim, completely unpredictable. Maybe with age, there's some predictive capability, but they're low-frequency, high-impact, catastrophic type, black swan type things. So good luck predicting based on that. Everybody has the same information. We all have access to the Matt Berries of the world, the experts. So everyone, it's a level playing field. Yeah, the information is very symmetric. So if you're any better than someone else at fantasy, it would take hundreds of years of playing seasons over and over for you to accumulate a statistically significant advantage in your record. The daily fantasy is a little bit more interesting because it's an optimization problem. It's like it's a knapsack problem. So you have these, but it's a stochastic knapsack. So it's not as easy as a typical one. And so I think that some people with some advanced techniques do have an edge. And certainly the guys behind the scenes who have the insider information on that have kind of proven that out, that if you have the right kind of data, if you have enough information on what other people are playing, you can play against that. So there are inefficiencies there, but they require some kind of inside information to take advantage of it.
I think, in contrast to football, I think basketball injuries are a little bit more predictable based on some of the work that I've done. You can make some projections. Certainly, age is relevant in a history of injuries. Sometimes there's over-specific work on predicting injuries. Oh, he injured his knee. What's the chance he's going to re-injure that knee? Well, that's not actually the question you care about when you're working for a team or, frankly, working in fantasy. Is you're worried, is it going to affect whether they miss games? And sometimes they don't re-injure that knee, they injure another part of their body because they were compensating. And that is, sometimes I've seen people do analysis of re-injuries, and that's not as relevant a lot of times for the questions that we're asking as either fantasy people or when you're working for a team. You just want to know whether they're going to miss games. So, and there is some predictability there for sure.
Let me talk a little bit about injuries. That was actually a topic I wanted to bring up. So there's maybe some diversity of opinion on this panel as to how predictable injuries are, and it might vary by sport. But I was told, and correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the heavy analytics that teams are using now are looking at speed to recovery from injuries, and not just the likelihood of re-injuring or injuring something else, but also what the quality of play is after that, and how to rehab better, and how to do things to get you back on the court playing at 100%. Is that big right now? Is that something? I mean, it's a combination of genetics as well as training, as well as all kinds of things that you have all this biofeedback data.
Yeah, the good thing is that there's a lot of people who are very interested in it and who have been looking at basic data for a long time. Trainers, strength guys, those guys have been in the league and they've gotten some of this basic data for a year. Now they're getting it every practice. So they can see what happens by practice, and they can see, okay, this guy is coming off the flu or something greater than the flu, and they can see, okay, how much were they able to push? And they can compare it to what they typically do. And that's what they were starting to build, is this a record of data that they can compare to. Because some players, whether they're healthy or sick or injured or not, they just don't play that hard in practice. And so they're building a record of what to work with. And it's the same thing with the SportView data, which is the in-game data that has information on how much they run and how fast they run and their load. And there are a lot of people, not just analytics people. There's other people also looking at that and building a record of what all that means. It's still pretty primitive based on what I've seen, unless it's more advanced in other sports.
No, but there's massive interest in medical health analytics. And in fact, there's some executives in football that equate analytics with like medical, well, oh, yeah, I understand you work in analytics. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, well, tell me about the kind of protein shakes my linemen should be drinking. Okay, well, which is why I kind of showed the the little Venn diagram there to start the brief. Everybody's got their own definition of analytics. I do sort of, it's kind of weird to say, but more traditional analytics, I guess. But there is a huge interest in it, and with the biometric stuff that they have coming online, it's just, and the millions of dollars that are invested in these players, I think we're going to see more and more and more of that kind of analysis.
And it's not just injuries either, right? It's also in terms of subbing players, how many minutes you want them on the floor. To use
So
a
one
basketball
of the
analogy,
things that
or-
I've seen in some of that data, now that I just thought about it with subs, is that you do see subs when they come in, they play harder than starters. They typically they run more, they run at faster speeds, all this kind of stuff.
And you see this in the VU data?
Oh yeah, you can see it. And a lot of the starters, they manage their energy output a lot more than starters, it looks like.
Because, I mean, the nice thing about that, too, is you have a lot more events than injuries, right? Injuries
Yeah.
are rare, infrequent,
Yeah.
but, diminishing. If you can measure changes in performance, which may be hard to measure.
Yep.
So, other questions? Yes?
Yeah, it's a node on a big network, I think. So I don't think it pushes the needle in terms of general fan interest, because the people who are there are already super interested. Kind of the general attendees that come there are already super interested. There is some media coverage. Obviously, ESPN plays a big part in that. But really, I can't say that there's a lot of media coverage of that event. You might hear about it in passing because it's not a big, sports. There's not a lot on the calendar in the sports world for a reason, but it is this node where GMs come and meet and executives and coaches, and comes and I get to talk to them and they meet me and I get to talk to them, and all this. I get to talk to Dean for the first time there, and I probably work at
That's how I
ESPN
met
now
these guys.
because probably how Toby heard about me, and that's why I'm here now, right? Because so it's just this giant network, and it's this big, huge node. It's probably the mother node on the network of sports analytics. And the coolest part about the Salon conference, if you're a speaker there, you get like the VIP pass to the speakers room, and that's what I just go hang out in there
Yep.
the whole time. And frankly, I don't go to some of the talks because speakers at these things can be really boring, by the way. And but you just get to rub shoulders with these really, really interesting kind of figures. I'm still a fan at some level, right? So I'm like, oh wow, I'm talking to Daryl Morey. But then we get to exchange ideas and just hear about the state of the art. I think that's the function it serves, is kind of this node on a network.
I think what happens is it was one of the reasons that ESPN started their analytics group, is the Salon conference. They went to it, they sent the right people to it, and they came back and said, these are really interesting stories. ESPN's, that's what they want to do, is they want to tell interesting stories, and they realize that there are a lot there. I will also tell you that when that first happened, I think the highest position of any NBA personnel that was at that was assistant GM, Sam Presti, who's now the GM in Oklahoma City. He was an assistant GM in San Antonio. He went to that first one. I guess Daryl was there, but was Daryl GM? I'm not even sure if he was GM.
No, Daryl was not. He was
Not
just
yet.
with the Celtics at that point, I think.
So what happened was that a few teams sent a couple people, and they hear about it, and then the next year you have 1 or 2 GMs, and then it kind of grows, and they ask each other, like, what are we doing here? And then they find out. And that's how it was an NBA-centric event, probably at first because of Daryl's involvement. And so it grew, and now I think every year they say, okay, do we have all 30 NBA teams? And I think they have for the last 2 years, had all 30 NBA teams there.
Lakers?
Yeah, Lakers went. Yep.
Yeah.
Lakers and Knicks are there, huh?
Yeah, the Lakers were late adopters, and they were quiet about it, but they actually have some pretty good people now. So.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm wondering if you've seen this level of use in analytics outside of the U.S., specifically like European football.
You do.
I see a lot of data and potential value coming from what you guys are doing, like a similar value to soccer.
The EPL, my understanding, I think almost every team in the EPL has some sort of analytics going on to varying degrees, as they have varying degrees of salary and payroll. I've talked to a few people over there. I've seen some of the analytics. It's not what I've seen, which they may be doing more sophisticated work in-house than I've seen. It's still a little primitive, and soccer is very complex. The data, they have some very good data. They have pro zone data, some of them, most of them, I believe, at this point, which is where every player is and where the ball is at any moment. So turning that again into a model, I think they're struggling a little bit with that, but that's the soccer world is going to blow up with this eventually. That already exists. Frankly, my company, we have data like that shows touches for Lionel Messi and all those guys in different leagues. And it is interesting to look at. You can see not only the position that they tend to play, but where they like to pass the ball to and things like that. So that is, there are maps. There are maps and there's data, but it is not a model yet, if that makes sense.
Other questions back there?
Sort of one big difference between European soccer and American sports in the playoffs, right? So a lot of the data, right, a lot of the analytics get benefit mainly because of law of large numbers. So is there sort of frustration in American sports that this stuff can get you in the playoffs, but the signal to noise ratio does not happen in the championships? And is the goal then of using that data is to just get in the playoffs, or is it physical championship?
As someone who's not won a championship yet, I'm frustrated by the fact that we haven't, but and you get into the playoffs, yeah, you can definitely use it to get into the playoffs. The playoffs are a different entity. In basketball, in baseball, not as much in football, but because you have a long series, it changes things a little bit. One is, during the regular season, 82-game season, you teach the players 3 things that they can know, and if you try to teach them more than that between games, they don't get it. In a playoff series, you're playing the same team over and over again. They see the first game and they are remembering for the next game, and they will see that same team over and over again. So they have a better game plan in their heads. So what I always felt like is we can use this to prepare them to win game 1. And then it's, okay, how do we adjust better? And there's not as much data from the regular season for how you adjust it, and that's where you end up counting on your models of how the game goes. If they do this, which is in sync, hopefully, it should be, with the coaching staff. So they have tactics, and hopefully you have models of those tactics so that you can better predict how those are going to work.
I mean, this relates to another issue that we always deal with, which is, ideally what you're trying to do is produce a team that gives you the highest probability of winning a championship, right? But it's such a discrete and infrequent outcome that you really can't model that very well, right? And you certainly don't have much data. Or to model, you have to put a ton of structure on the problem, right? So we keep folding it back, right? And we keep stepping it back. This is a big problem in soccer where there's also a lack of scoring, right? So, but how do you guys deal with that? It's always a trade-off between using as many degrees of freedom as possible, right, with the data, as well as imposing some structure.
Well, I think that's like if you go back to, again, the Philly or the the Philly or the Oakland A's, or this whole idea of what Darryl said to me, that you're not trying to be, one of 30 fund managers that are beating the S&P or whatever. You're trying to be one of 30 teams that wins the championship, just the one. And so with that, you can't, all this like talk about, Moneyball doesn't work in the playoffs. It's like bullshit to me. It's just like, what it is you're like nothing works, right? Like definitively, right? It all gives you a better chance to win, or a better chance. So as an organization or as a team, you're thinking like top to bottom, like I want to run this the best way possible. And ultimately my goal is to win a championship, and ultimately my goal is to actually have a franchise that makes money, right? And like some of the best franchises, you see what they do. It's not just on the sports side, it's on the business side too. They use analytics to figure things out, right? And so when you think about the ultimate goal, if you're a fan of a team, you just want your team to have to be, in the best position to win a championship. And, that they may be like getting there all the time and losing, that's fine, because if they keep getting there, they're going to win.
Good process, good results.
Yeah, it's process. It's process. Yeah, it's process, not outcome kind of stuff.
Yo, go ahead, Ray.
Isn't that, it depends on your objective function. So you can maximize the probability of winning any game, which could get you the 5th seed in basketball, say, or you can take a lot of variance.
Well, that's the variance is the.
But that's not it's not clear that, like, I heard Darryl say that 1 in 30, but there might be an objective function that says, for my team, I'm happy to get to the 2nd or 3rd round of the playoffs. There's a trade-off between going and taking a punt on guys that are in rehab or those types of things, right? It's not clear that everybody's objective function is to take as much variance as possible to win the championship. I mean, they'll say that.
That objective function does change, I would say, a little bit from year to year, and it also changes among the individuals. Certainly there are people, and you think about this when you're front office, does that GM have 1 year left on his deal? You think about those, and those objective functions
So the Sixers
can change, yeah.
All right, they took variance and so forth. But like, you could also just say that I'm going to try to get myself to be the 3rd seed.
And I think
Playoffs. There's a different set of decisions you make.
Well, different sports have different degrees of or proportions of luck in them. So in football, you can play that game where a playoff berth is a lottery ticket, and you play the ticket, and who knows. Very rarely does the best team in football win the championship. The best team and the champion are two different things, and only sometimes they happen to be one and the same team. So kind of reminding people of that can be important. In NBA, you have 100 possessions per game, right, per team, is that right? And then 48 minutes and 7-game series. So if you had fundamentally changed the NBA to, a 40-minute game and a 3-game series, or like college, just a one-game tournament, you would be much more like the NFL, where you could just kind of play that game where you get into, hey, I'm going to shoot for the 8 seed and just roll the dice and hope we get hot. So the number of trials is really important, and the fundamental structure of each sport is very important. And to address the question about the EPL, where they don't really have playoffs, let's say, they have it's much more, or just like baseball used to be with the pennant. It was much more likely that you had to be the best team, and you can look at that chart there, and you can tell who the best team or the best 2 teams are, and as I said to Dean last night, it looks like it's all a race for 2nd place right now. So it depends on the sport, I guess, is one answer.
The analogy of being one being the S&P. You can set up your investment in a way that you maximize your ability to consistently beat the S&P for 10 years in a row, or you can go out and take punts and have some positive probability of being the #1 ranked hedge fund in Americans, right? Some people choose the latter, and some people choose the former in terms of so then a lot of that's to do with what your objective.
Well, and I think.
Well, but
Go ahead,
so
Jeff.
I agree, and I disagree. I mean, the question came from someone saying like, "Hey, how do you use analytics to actually win a championship?" And that was the question. And the way you'd use it is build a model, a process that you believe over time will work. And you can't say to me, I have an ability to set up my team to make it to the second or third round of the playoffs every year and believe that that's not ultimately something that's going to help you win a championship, right? Like there's
And this is what I mean by folding it back, right? What you're doing is it's hard to model the probability of winning a championship, but you get as close as you possibly can.
right, but
it
would be even
they're very
harder to model
consistent.
where my outcome is that I'm going to make it to the second or third round of the playoffs,
that's
right?
right, yeah.
It's just, the idea is that you want to, in basketball, all right, if you think about it, you need 3 great players, right? That's what, and to get those 3 great, what's that?
Rule of thumb, yes.
Right, but rule of thumb,
Yes.
right? 3 great players, but to get those 3 great players is hard, right? And so that's where this whole idea of what Sam, I think, is doing is coming in. He's like trying to get himself into the best situation to get 3 great players.
And his objective function is to sacrifice the present in order to kind of establish that for the long run.
Right, and the question becomes like, this is the objective function. Would Sixers fans rather have his team be fighting for the 8th place spot right now, or doing what they're doing? Right.
I think.
Yep.
And they never had the opportunity to be big superstars because they never got the draft pick, right? So a strategy is what Philly's doing, which is tanking up to get some positive probability that they'll get a LeBron out of the draft pick.
But Billy or Sam, because Billy is doing something totally different, like Billy Bean.
And Daryl Morey is too.
Right.
Daryl Morey is too.
I think Billy and Daryl's strategies are relatively similar.
Yes, exactly.
Where they get these players that have what they've considered to be high ceilings, and are relatively low risk, meaning they can get them at reasonable salaries, and then they bring them in, and if they all hit at once, it's great. If they all turn out like Ty Lawson, then it's not so great.
Well, I think Jeff asked a really interesting question a second ago, and it applies to like what the objective function, and you have, what. So Jeff asked, what's the how do you use analytics to win a championship? And I think it's really useful to sit down and maybe write that down and draw out a process. Like, okay, a player selection, that's really important. Making good decisions during the game, calling timeouts at the right time, that's going to help. And you kind of chart, how one decision affects the next, and leads to a win. So in the military, we have a kill chain, which is maybe not a pleasant discussion, but the kill chain is, everything from detection, intelligence, using your sensors to localize the target, identify the target, make sure it's not a baby milk factory, all the way to, putting the logistics in place, the gas in the air, the refueling, and then you get a guy like me in an F-18 who's like the very last part of that chain, I'm the very last link in that chain. That's the guy that gets on TV at the end, they make movies about, but it's a long chain, this kill chain. And so I think of things in terms of like a win chain, or an analytic chain. Okay, what we need, we need data, we need a model, what are the things we're really what's the objective? And I think it's really helpful to, these things we operate and we assume these things. We're assuming when you talk about different objective functions different teams have, we're assuming, a lot of what we're talking about assumes teams want to win, or want to win a championship, or want to maximize the strength of their probability of winning a championship. And when that may not be true. And so it's really helpful to kind of elicit and articulate those assumptions that may not be, we might discover that we're making kind of false assumptions. And I think that'd be really helpful. So.
And this is relevant to the draft because a lot of the times the questions that we have in the draft are, who are the guys with the most upside? Who are the safest? So you can build different models for those 2 questions. And you can do it other ways, just with variance on your predictions, those kind of things. And those outcomes the people in that room making that decision, if they're waiting, we're going for upside this year, then they can make that call. I've been in both rooms. I've been in rooms where they wanted upside, and I've been in rooms where they want the safest pick. And sometimes there's kind of an overlap, but I don't think they know what their objective function is a lot of times until you ask them the question in basketball language.
I mean, it's also related to, we teach a sports analytics class, Kevin Murphy, John Heising, and myself in Chicago, and we have our students do a project. One of the projects that we had them do, which I thought was really interesting, was to look at trades, right? So if you look at any trade in any sport, presumably it ought to benefit both teams. That's what trade means, right? Both teams think ex ante, it's beneficial to them, otherwise why do it?
Yep.
If, of course, they have the same objective function, right? And so the question is, you know, can you find any hard analytical evidence associated with that? Now, the problem is, I think what the students concluded was it was inconclusive, right? It was hard to tell. You can, ex post, you can tell what was a good or bad trade, and people always talk about that. But ex ante, could you see the merit in those trades? And on average, you definitely can. But I think there's things that you can do to think about this problem, but it's difficult, so.
Trade talk actually is fairly limited around
Yeah, it's
the
not a ton.
NBA. I mean, people think it happens all the time, but people talk internally a lot more than they will talk across the teams.
Yeah.
And but a lot of times when you are talking to teams, you are phrasing it as, all right, we're trying to find something that's beneficial to you and to us, because no one wants to get exploited. And there are cases when you've made trades with the same team and say a couple of those went so well for you that the other guys are just going to shut the door. They don't want to talk to you anymore. You took advantage of us twice. And
Yeah,
you want to keep those going, because there's only 29 teams you can make a trade with, and you don't want to cut those off.
Right, and sometimes it's dynamics, right? A team ready to win now versus one that's going to wait.
Absolutely. Timing is arbitrage opportunity. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, yes, and then.
So finance, different markets have different levels of efficiency. So models would be, maybe we're only so well in large cap, better in small cap. So we talk mostly about professional sports. If you move to the college level, Division 1, 2, 3, maybe high school, you do the same analytics. Are these analytics methods being used there, and do they become more productive at those levels?
I have
college football.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, big programs in college football are adopting those slowly. What's really interesting to me about the different levels of competition is the mismatches. And so mismatches drive innovation. And I think you see, so I'm a Navy grad, and we have the triple option, and we had a great year, and it's basically a scheme-based year. We happen to have a couple great players this year on top of that. So that there's, we have to play Notre Dame every year and some other big schools, and we just don't have the athletes. So it requires something else. It motivates innovation. So I think really a lot of the, I think there's a fertile ground
That's great. Like when I think about who I consider to be the best up and coming basketball coach is Brad Stevens, and a lot of his strategies were developed because of the mismatch, right? Yeah. He's at Butler University, and how is he going to compete with, the Dukes of the world? And that's how he developed a lot of his systems, I think.
Right.
That's
Like most colleges are the A's. Most colleges are the Oakland A's, right? Up against the Yankees, who win the division every year, year after year. Yeah. So Vanderbilt playing Alabama every year. What are they going to do? So they need a trick. They need something else.
And I think you've kind of said it. Yeah, adoption of some of the analytics has actually been more embraced at the lower levels than at the highest levels. And my thing with looking at college basketball coaches, if you are at Butler and you are very successful, you can move on to a better team. Brad Stevens jumped all the way to the NBA, but you can go from Butler to UCLA, which he was offered, or Kentucky or something like that, a better school. If you are in the NBA and you win, you win a championship, but it doesn't mean you're going to move on to another team. So there's a disparity between, if you are winning at a lower level, you can move up a level very quickly individually. If you win at the NBA level, you win a championship, that's great, but it's not as though you're moving up to the next level. There's no level beyond the NBA. So there's actually a lot of college basketball teams that embrace this, in part thanks to Ken Pomeroy, who uses a lot of analytics on his site. Florida, Miami, I know Duke, UNC only a little bit, and I went to UNC, so I know some of that. Louisville, there was a coach at Marquette who has moved on. I think he's at Tennessee now. He was always a big buyer. There's a lot of college teams, actually.
Question back there, yeah.
So how long are we going to have to watch coaches in the NFL monitor what they do and who are at? It seems like that's a very straightforward analytic thing, and yet if you're sitting around watching football all day when you're watching coaches make arguably stupid decisions.
Yeah, I'm doing my best.
No, but that's the whole thing, right? They're making decisions based on like the whole idea that they want to preserve their jobs, right? Based on that whole old adage, history will tell you it's better to fail conventionally than it is to succeed unconventionally. And that's what it is. And as soon as we have real people with job security, so as much as we keep coming back to the Sam Hinkies, but like the reason he's able to do this is because he has like some level of job security from the ownership. And these coaches don't, right? Like the reason Bill Belichick is able to do what he does is because he knows he's not getting fired. So as soon as we get to a world where that's the case, it's going to be a while, though. I mean, it's already taken longer than I ever thought it would for people to understand. You still see these guys doing things that don't make any sense. Mike Tomlin kicks field goals from the 3-yard line, but thinks it's a good idea to go for 2 half of the time. So explain to me the expected value there.
Yeah, perfect. I'll throw out 2 more great theories on that. But I think a limited number of coaches are making 4th down decisions simply to kind of save their necks. I think it's very true that the braver ones are the ones with the most security. There's prospect theory, right, where a loss is twice as kind of potent as an equivalent gain. And so when they look at 4th downs and they think about going for it, they're seeing a big downside. They're exaggerating the downside, and they're underestimating the upside. And I think the second thing is much more kind of fundamental, where football is where I started off talking about how it's the most complex sport. And so that complexity means that it falls back on conservative traditional values. In terms of the truest small c definition of the word conservative, is a very conservative sport. Because of that complexity, coaches fall back on the tried and true as a convention. Jeff said they lean on convention. Well, why is it that the convention is the next question? And football has evolved over time where the scores were like 6-3, and a punt could be a death blow to the other team where it would never see the other side of the field all day long. Football has changed and evolved, and it's still changing more so than most other sports. Certainly baseball and basketball has been changing as well. But so it's a moving target, so they're keeping up. They're slowly adapting. I can tell. I look at the numbers, and they're catching up. But then the target's moving ahead too, and they're just not. The market is moving, and they're not catching up.
Let me add one more thing to that, because it's related to something Jeff mentioned a lot earlier, which I think is really important, which is, in addition to incentives, it also changed when we start evaluating decisions rather than outcomes, right? That's one of the problems, and you see this not just in sports, you see it in finance, you see it in all kinds of endeavors, is this, hiring and firing decisions are typically made on outcomes and not necessarily the best ex-ante decision. Now, we have the analytics, certainly in sports, to look at what the value of that ex-ante decision was, right? So you could look at the expected point differential of going for it versus kicking it and how big that was. The fact that it didn't work out is irrelevant, right? It was an incredibly wise decision given the spread. And I don't know that any teams are actually using that, owners or GMs, to evaluate their coaches.
Not to evaluate.
And to incentivize them, right?
Are.
And that I think would help a ton. That's just one example, but you could do this across the field. So I think we have time for one more.
Just interested in your overall impression on the state of the science at this point, so that maybe in the future, what your thoughts are on the future of making this real big money in terms of sort of bridging the fantasy, individual, kind of make it kosher in some sense for big money in terms of investment pools and so forth. What's your thoughts on that prospects? Maybe the obstacles or just the state of the science in general, and then sort of bridge that into maybe, thinking like hedge fund strategies down the line if they're able to overcome some of these obstacles. What are your overall thoughts on that? Sort of bridging the finance with it.
How to capitalize on the movement, or
Yeah, so it's not just you're talking about the owners, and they're benefiting from it, obviously winning championships, but the individual person who's playing fantasy
Well, if sports gambling becomes legal in the U.S., you're going to have a non-correlated market that may be allowed to put significant money in.
Yeah.
Probably is not going to be that simple in terms of doing it, because just logistically, it's not. This is a whole nightmare. Like if any of you guys are thinking about trying to use analytics for sports betting, just don't. It's hard, and it's hard to get capital down. The amount of liquidity in these markets is tiny. If you have liquidity in an area and you beat someone too well, they'll kick you out. Like there isn't a lot of. I guess that sports gambling presents a very interesting thing, because potentially it could be huge, but potentially it could be nothing. So that's the only thing I can think of that would be big money in this area.
I think the science
definitely
has potential to do incredible things, and I think it goes beyond sports. I think a lot of the things with the moving dots, with evaluating productivity of people doing their job, I think there's a lot of difficult science there. I think we're starting to attract some of the smart people who would have gone into other fields, like your field, into sports to do some of this, and some of them at this stage you're still accepting lower pay. But I think you look at the amount of money that was in basketball analytics 10 years ago versus now, it's probably 100-fold as much now as there was 10 years ago. So it's not going to keep growing that fast, but it's a lot more. And I think those smart people, once we figure out the game and you get to a certain point, those people also branch off into other sports or into other fields again, but that's the cycle of innovation.
Be the house. That's the way you make money. Be the house, and like pro trade.
Market making.
You're not staking money out, on one outcome or the other, but you're a service to other people who are, and there's money to be made there, and there's certainly already kind of saturated market in that regard.
So anyway, I want to thank the panelists. I think they're all going to be at MIT in another month or two at the Sports Analytics Conference as well. But thank you guys for your time, and thanks for the questions.